Great. Thanks, everybody. I'm Galen McAndrew. Normally, I would be up here wearing a suit for these presentations, but Brussels Airlines lost my luggage, so I'm coming to you in our new Phil Foundation swag. We're going to be doing a open discussion sort of design session. So if you're in here, you're stuck now. You're going to be helping us solve all these problems. Really, the big problem is we have this kind of one main on-chain subsidy, this data cap. It's kind of the primary model that we have to try and incentivize certain behaviors, and it's kind of one big hammer. Quick recap, data cap requires increased collateral, and it carries a 10x quality adjusted power multiplier. There's also a lot that goes into sort of off-chain program rules and requirements and who qualifies and who gets to get data cap and who gets to give it out. We're not really going to focus on that. The talk today is not going into redesigning the Phil Plus program. That's not what we're doing here. What we want to focus on is what could different on-chain subsidy mechanisms be? What additional levers could we have? So that brings in the question of like, what do we really want to subsidize? Like, what do we care about? Different people in the ecosystem are going to have different opinions on this. At a very high level, I think that most of us would agree that we want to incentivize data storage. This is kind of a mandate that Filecoin has been given from its inception, as far as I know, at least as long as I've been here, is that we care about real clients with real data doing real distributed deal making. Filecoin in and of itself is not really designed just for sort of a closed box, closed loop, simple minting using hard drives to mine a token. That is not the primary purpose that we've been trying to design for. There have been a lot of different talks today about different services that people are designing and building, different ways to, evolve this protocol to be more functional, more performant, have more use cases. So fundamentally, we care about incentivizing this data storage use. We could think about these in like some different kind of broad categories. We're going to try and turn this into an open discussion and see what we can get. But we could think about this as maybe the subsidy comes from something that is client controlled, where currently, if you look at data cap, that is supposed to be a client controlled subsidy. The client themselves goes and gets the data cap token, and they are the one burning that in the deal with the storage provider to change that quality adjusted power. So the client theoretically is in control of that interaction. There could be a different type of subsidy that is really driven by the SP that the client would not have to have any say in using. There could also be different automated deterministics that we could use where it happens without any flag or input or setting or controlled by either the client or the SP. These are just some of the categories I've thought of. If you have other ideas of like meta level categories, would love to hear them. There are a couple existing proposals that are either currently open or have been sort of open but then resolved in the past sort of 2 years. One of them that's relatively popular is this unlimited data cap minting. Some pros and cons to that. Again, I'm not going to get into trying to like explain this entire FIP and all of its history and what would lead to, but fundamentally the argument is allow any actor to just make as much data cap as they want. It would come with that increased collateral, but they would get the increased quality adjusted power. If you were an SP and you wanted to just seal up an exabyte of zeros and ones and call it verified data and pay that collateral cost, you could do so. I think some of the costs to that change would be that in a year or two, we would be in a similar boat where the SPs are saying we're no longer making money. We've locked up all these hard drives. They are not returning an ROI. We're not building towards more clients. We're not building towards more markets. I think that this is maybe a more short-sighted solution to the current economic problem. Another one that we saw was this sector duration multiplier. The argument here was let's have a different multiplier on chain that says if you were doing a deal for a certain amount of time, it would come with a different multiplier. I think this is a good example of what I'm talking about here of multiple different types of subsidies. The sector duration multiplier argument was it is a predetermined scale calculation. If you are making a deal for 5 years, it would carry this amount of power increase. If you were doing a deal for 1 year, it would carry a smaller power increase. That was independent of going and getting verified. You could do that. You could not. There were all these other off-chain interactions that you could choose to do to go get data cap, but the sector duration multiplier was a separate and different subsidy that could happen in parallel. I think there were arguments as to economically why that might not work or why people were opposed to it, but I think that fundamentally the argument of having other parallel types of subsidy is a compelling and interesting one. And another existing proposal that we've seen is to just roll back the multiplier, to scale it down to basically sunset the subsidy program going from 10x to a decreasing down to 1x. Again, personally, I think that that is not building us any further towards adding new features or subsets, like new use cases. I think that this is just rolling off some complications and shifting a lot of burden of what the program currently offers onto other players. So some of the new potential proposals that have been bandied about that I would love to get feedback on. What would it look like to have some kind of retroactive subsidy structure where a deal is made between these two parties and there are some terms of that deal that need to be verified later on, perhaps across time for maybe the entire year or 5-year or life of the deal, or maybe it is something that only needs to be verified once, but after a certain period of time. An example would be a retrieval subsidy. If we were to set a new type of subsidy that says if a deal lands on chain with a storage provider and it remains retrievable according to a certain subset of protocols across the life of that deal, then it can continue to accrue a higher subsidy. You could basically say, if we care about this fast data being hot and retrievable, then let's give that a higher subsidy to incentivize SPs to do so. And let's just use on-chain deterministics to do it. Another one could be data distribution. If we have a piece or a CID or a set of data and we say, this data has already been verified once, we care that this data has been indexed, sealed, is a good piece of data, but we want it to show up on the network 5 other times or 50 other times in these different regions, we're not going to subsidize it until it does so. But it's something that we could retroactively prove once it lands on chain, then it could get the subsidy. One of the things we're facing right now is we give a subsidy to a client with a lot of upfront qualitative trust, and then they turn around and go do deal making, and we have not the best mechanism to manipulate whether or not they followed through. So brainstorming here, like what could some other on or off-chain retroactive requirements be that we've heard different ones of off-chain structures where you have different guilds or groups or voting mechanisms that say, well, let's have a client show up, let's have them do the deal, let's have them work with SPs, and then let's go have this guild go try and retrieve it, unpack it, check that it is indexed, and then retroactively apply a subsidy to it. Or let's have a group that says, well, we claimed to care about this scientific data. Did it actually add a lot of value to the overall network? And use some kind of retro public goods PGF model where people vote on data sets to determine what gets a higher subsidy. Just ideas. I think there are pros and cons to both of those. Some other proposals that we've seen are simply around deal price. Again, similar to the sector duration multiplier, if we claim to be caring about paid client deals, we could just say if there is a deal price that is on-chain improvable, that could carry an increased subsidy. There could be a scale calculation. If somebody is willing to pay, let's say it's 500 fil per TIB, clearly someone thinks that that data is valuable. What if we had a higher subsidy for that? Independent of the data cap verification subsidy. It wouldn't require anyone to go prove that that piece of data was what it claimed to be. We are just going to look at if someone puts a price on chain, someone cares about that data should be valuable, the network could subsidize it. There could be others. What if you use certain deal-making pathways? Some of the things that we've heard with various, direct data onboarding or other, ways that people are preparing and adding data to the Filecoin network. What if we pick certain pathways and we say, if you are going to use this portal or this protocol or this standard, and those will carry an increased subsidy. And we just say, these are the ones that have been vetted. We know that these are teams that are working with real clients. If you use that, it could carry an on-chain subsidy. I would love to pause and pass the mic around to the audience, because this is supposed to be more of a brainstorming and design session. Thoughts on just the things that we've pitched here? I mean, like some of the existing proposals, people probably have opinions on. Some of these new proposals, there's a hand.
Can you define the space of what you mean when you say subsidy? Because I think that ends up, that mechanic that gets chosen is as important as the governance around what qualifies and in what way.
Yeah, so I think the argument here is that the subsidy should just be a QAP multiplier.
So it's a re-slicing of the block reward pie, but not a change in overall inflation of the network or any of these other things.
I think the argument is that it could be anything. It could be a more tectonic shift in a change of how the tokenomics and block rewards determined. But I think a simpler first step would be, what would it look like to have just a different set of rules for QAP, where if you have one set of rules for CCs, one set of rules for regular deals, and only one other pathway, which is a 10x QAP, what would it look like to say, okay, if there's a deal price on chain, that carries a different QAP. And so then the calculation as to how power and block rewards and all of that is determined wouldn't necessarily need to change. It's just, how is my power determined?
So how does then such a subsidy, which is a power multiplier of an active QAP, interact with something retroactive, where you've only figured out what that power is later after the deal has finished or partway through the deal? Does it apply to sort of subsequent deals? Does it
I think that's a great question. I think that the question there is, should that person then have, if we threw some numbers at this and it's right now it's a 1x for the life of the deal, but halfway through the deal, let's use one like retrieval. Their retrieval scores continue to remain high and performant. Then have a halfway through the deal start to scale up this other retrieval subsidy, right? Maybe we need to wait halfway. Maybe we do it at some linear scaling point. The longer the deal remains active and increasing in high retrieval scores, their QAP multiplier for retrieval scales up with it. So their power over time would change, not necessarily needing to be a retroactive change to any previously won blocks. It's just that, well, now halfway through my deal, that deal is worth more because it's been retrievable this whole time.
Yeah, so I'm gonna play devil's advocate here.
Good, great. We need some more devils. I don't deal with any contrarian opinions at all in the Plus world.
So I think one of the reasons why people kind of dislikes the current incentive structure is that, especially with new proposals like this as well, you kind of change what we're incentivizing in the network. With deal price, we're incentivizing something else than hard drives. Mm-hmm. Are we fine with that as a protocol? Because we're still trying to incentivize storage on Filecoin. Right. But here we are shifting the block rewards to incentivizing deals. And I think people would have been fine with that if we're incentivizing it with something else than the fill token. Mm-hmm. Fill deal token would have been fine, just to test out that incentivization path. But I think that's where a lot of people disagree with
Yeah, I would argue though that not making a change doesn't save us from that problem. And that continuing to have like a single 10x QAP system, because we're like, well, if we change and add a new QAP, then we're changing what we subsidize, and we don't necessarily all agree on that. I think that remaining in the current status quo, where people are, very unhappy with the single fill plus data cap like potential pathway, and they say this is not really building us towards more clients or more paid deals. We're just trying to like game this system to min-max this one existing system. So what would it look like to have other alternatives? And it's like, yes. Does that mean that we're then incentivizing on-chain deal pricing? Yes. If we create an on-chain subsidy that looks at something like deal price, that would mean that the network is saying, yes, we care about that thing. And so the argument is, what are other things that we could care about, and why limit it? Why not say we care about deal pricing, but we also care about fast retrieval? We also care about really good cold storage. How would we take something if we claim to care about very good cold archival, highly indexed, highly reputable data sources? What other subsidies could we build around that? I think the argument here is like, rather than trying to take the one 10x QAP hammer and apply it to all use cases, what could another subsidy be that applies to other use cases? Question?
Yeah, and no, I'd expand upon that of like scaling it to based on, because like the whole concept of like, great, you have like capacity is 1, useful data is 9, added up they make 10. So that's like the overall like ratio of how Filecoin wants to deploy its resources as a network. Like the mission of Filecoin is all around making it a good foundation for humanity's information. So like if you talk about like what's the purpose of the fill token and the fill block reward, like actually it's a 1-to-9 ratio of what is aiming to be flowed to pure capacity versus what's aiming to be flowed to actually deploying useful data on the network and getting clients and other things like that. So I think it does, having maybe like scaling Fill Plus for different tiers of client access or things like deal price. I think what feels uncomfortable to a lot of folks is, hey, like how, what are the chances for abuse in different subsets of those tiers? So like for something like deal price, for example, it is totally possible for someone to, be both the client and the storage provider in a deal and then put their own money up as the deal price if that's going to earn them more yield on that money than just putting it as collateral to, store more sectors or something like that. So something like a deal price incentive would have to, have the same yield function as general collateral in Filecoin, but that could be okay. Like that does have yield to, say be loaning fill to storage providers, and so you could have a similar ratio for folks who are doing that in deal collateral in sectors as well. So that's my thought process.
I think that it is important to recognize that Fill Plus was designed as a program to incentivize specific behaviors. And now we're just extending what that specific behavior is. And like if we start from what is good for Filecoin as a network, and then look at, well, if this behavior is good, can we also measure it? And then build an that's an incentive structure. And there will be some things that probably, like good data is good for Filecoin network, but unless we are able to define what is good data and how do we measure it, then we can't really use that. We can't build an incentive structure around that. So I like what Galen is talking about. Obviously, we've talked about it a lot, but the kind of more structured approach of expanding Fill Plus into incentivizing different behaviors, not necessarily all of it at once. Like if we wanted to incentivize only a perfect storage provider, we'll have like one maybe. But if we can say, we are recognizing your efforts towards going to, and what Will talks about, the race to the top. is something that we need to think about.
So I guess I have two questions and comments. So like one, you're talking about increasing the block reward over time. I do generally have concerns there around like basically making long-term players or really like giving them all the power. And that can be a bit of a problem. So like I'd prefer to have something that basically says, okay, you need to be this retrievable. If you are, you get full plus. If you're not, your rewards start going down to some baseline, and then if you are, it goes back up. My second concern is honestly just like checking retrievability is a really hard problem, and our current solution for it works when and only when the incentives are very, very low. Because like basically right now there's very little incentive to attack our retrieval checking system. But once you have like an incentive to attack a retrieval checking system, you can't just rely on like unique IP addresses checking for things. You have to have some kind of like complicated staking and voting system that's a lot more complicated than we currently have. And I don't think I can even solve that.
That's why we're here. No, I think like these are good points. There's another, and I have a couple other slides. So yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna kind of ask, am I right in thinking that traditionally Phil Plus has been given for like the quality of the data, but the things you're proposing now is more like the quality of the service provided by the storage providers? And so it's a bit of a shift in what it's given for. So maybe just finish the point, like when you look at AWS, they don't mind what data you're actually storing. They provide SLAs about like retrievability or durability of that data. And so it feels like there's two different things. And if we're just kind of moving it from like, okay, this is quality data into like, this is, yeah, I suppose we're trying to find like a heuristic for like what can we measure to show that the data is quality data? Like, is it being retrieved? But so my point is like, does the quality of the data even matter at that point? Or should it just be about SLAs of like what the storage providers are providing?
Yeah, so I guess what I'm discussing, not even really proposing, what I'm discussing is why not both? Why not have multiple options where we have a system to look at the quality of the data? What would that look like? Arguably, that is what Phil Plus was initially trying to do, is trying to care on the client side. It is trying to say you are showing up and claiming to be a client who is a data owner or a data preparer. You are going to claim what the data is and how you are going to onboard quality usable data to the network. And so Phil Plus then created all of these programmatic rules and off-chain mechanisms to try to qualitatively assess those things and then scale that trust over time and award more data cap based on meeting program requirements and then getting additional access to this like data cap credit, right? That was very much driven around this idea of like we care about quality of the data. But that brings into question of like, well, everyone has different opinions on quality. There's so much weight to this system. There's, and again, like fundamentally, the argument that I'm making here is that when you only have that one pathway, everyone's going to say, well, what is the min-max way to like game this system? If you care about perceived quality of data and the only outlet is a 10x multiplier, I'm going to learn how to like do whatever it takes to like game that system. So if we can introduce these other mechanisms, it's not necessarily that we're saying, okay, we no longer care about quality. We now only care about deal pricing. The argument is, well, some people are going to care more about deal pricing and they will attempt to min-max pragmatically that avenue. And yes, if we put a thing on here that says, I'm going to only attach my own money to it, we don't know that it's real data. We're like, right, but we aren't saying that we care about that for that subsidy, for that use case. We care about this use case of paid storage deals. We have this other pathway and this other program to incentivize and subsidize paid storage deals. And so rather than saying, okay, well, we care about paid storage deals, but also encrypted, private data, but also public, open, retrievable data, but also, and you are trying to make all of these different use cases get to that same end goal of a 10x data cap QAP. And I think that's where we're trying to say, what are some other ways to slice this pie? Going forwards really quick, because all of this touches on the other thing that I want to talk about, which is we have a major barrier and limitation to testing these things, because so many of these changes require a FIP. They lead to all of these conversations around, okay, well, if you were going to do retrieval testing, that would mean this party would behave in A, B, and C way, and therefore 6 months down the line, the network would look like X. And you're like, well, how do you know that? You don't. You are making maybe an educated guess, but we are trying to map out for all these different stakeholders for very changing token prices, for very different, off-chain economic realities, geopolitical realities that our SPs and our service providers are facing. And we're trying to sit in an ivory tower and say, well, we think the protocol should look like this. What I would like to do is try and say, what are some other ways that we can scope and test without running into this like factionalization problem where, oh, I don't agree with that FIP because it's going to cost me and my business this, or I've already tooled my services to look this way and now you're changing the rules on me, so I'm going to brigade any discussion on this. Because that's where we're hitting headwinds, and that's where not making changes to the on-chain subsidy is still leading to a lot of this embedded friction. So what could it look like? And I think there was an interesting one just a moment ago with fast finality, where they're having this kind of proofing phase during one of the network upgrades and then an acceptance. What would it look like to design some different on-chain subsidies, but then have them in a set interval of time? What could it look like to, I don't know, write a FIP, and let's use like just one of these examples of like sector duration multiplier. That was one that got discussed a lot in the past, that had a lot of opinions and thoughts. What would it look like to say, okay, for this FIP, we are going to do a 6-month testing period on the sector duration multiplier, and this is the data that we're going to collect, and it's going to, we're going to launch it in this FIP with a rollback or a pause in a certain number of network upgrades down the line, and then test the impact of those things. I think that where we run into a lot of problems is like all the people that are building businesses on Filecoin, they say, well, I need to be able to like map out my ROI. I need a roadmap. I need funding and budget for all of this. And anytime you change the protocol, you are introducing kind of cost and risk to my business operation. And so I'm curious, what are some of the ways that we as developers in here can like help test these different ideas that do cost a lot? Comment in the back.
Yeah, I've been queuing up comments. I think there's to your point earlier about like, hey, what if we add additional programs that are measuring for different things? Maybe that avoids people like trying to find the most rational outcome. And my feedback point is when it all flows into block rewards, no, it won't. People will still try and find the rational minimization strategy of like, even if it's not binary, and I think it not being binary is good because it makes it more of a gradient and makes more opening of like a range of choices that people can make. But even if you're like, great, we're going to have a program that rewards data quality and a program that rewards on-chain deal payments and a reward that does these other things. If they all flow back down into a overall they add up to a 10x multiplier on block rewards or something like that, then you will find the rational strategy of combining them to or attacking those programs or whatever in order to find a rational strategy as just a decentralized network with a lot of rational players in addition to like honest and altruistic players. So there's that point. There was also a point that had been made earlier around like, oh, well, what if there were like literally different sub-currencies at play here? So you have Filecoin overall that is, achieving the overall mission of Filecoin, but maybe you could have a capacity coin that is just focused on, your CC sectors and your basic block reward, which might give you what you're asking for there of like, hey, I have a baseline predictability. This thing is, operating on its own subschedule versus maybe a deal-making coin and and then you segment out a separate pot of funds for which you operate tests and trials before things get standardized at a protocol level. Because realistically, even if you're doing like a 3-month trial and that's actually hitting block reward production, I think we're gonna see the same feeling of like, I can't forecast my business 6, 9, 18 months into the future because I don't know what tests are going to be run and how those are going to impact me. So maybe there's actually something here to trying to create different sub-currencies or different sub-pots of resources where that testing can happen separate from, predictable business operations or something like that.
So to your last point, Molly, well, I'll first make my first point because I'll forget. I almost forget twice already. I think that the thing with doing different incentive programs or incentivizing different things, and especially going down the road of which ones can we measure as objectively and as automatically as possible, or in an automated way, leads us to a much better decentralization outcome as well. Because now there is this smart contract that runs and says, okay, yes, I could retrieve your data, great. Here's your whatever incentive token that we give you. So I think it's a good move towards also people who are concerned about Phil Plus or any other incentive program sitting in the hands of several gods and giving it. The thing that you're talking about with the currencies, and any kind of like testing in small groups. Something that we've seen with move to the allocators and now opening the request for allocators and saying, hey, you could build this other thing. No, people will take the path of least resistance. And so if we have this program that is running currently and then they know how to use to their benefit, they will not go towards, oh, I'm going to try and get my extra capacity token from the capacity because I already am getting my 10x from this general program. So without closing off those pathways, we will not move people towards testing the other ones. But this is a pain because, yes, if you're a business, well, I thought I'm going to get my 10x and I can't.
Right. I think the other thing that we need to be cognizant of is that a lot of what allows you to set up a structure to be an SP, and when you're looking at economics and so forth, is you're looking at the full length of deals, and for doing that for 3 years or 5 years. And so are you going to enter a testing retrievability program for 3 months, but now you've got all of these deals with this higher cost associated with them, and you don't have any certainty that you'll keep getting a reward or any particular benefit, or that they'll be eligible for that after 3 months when the next experiment runs. So, are there structures where you can say, great, if you enter it in this trial period, like you're signing up for a deal multiplier that will keep that deal over the length of the deal, not over the length of the trial period, or other things that give you the stability to be willing to pay that upfront cost on some set, but maybe you can have a limited number of SPs that or of deal onboarding that will go with one of these. I think the other thing that we've not really had a good answer for is on the incentivization is you need a carrot as well as a stick. And so what is this funding pool that you can use to have a reward for taking risks of doing something experimental that might have less certainty or more risk? And we haven't really come up with any structure for an additional incentive for why you might want to attempt to do better. We've talked some of that of like, oh, we could restructure it for retro. It's the same pot. And so I think there's this question of like having some capital pool where you can say, great, like we want to see what the actual cost is of having deals of this form with this level of retrievability. At the end of the next 3 months, we will offer 200 fill to each SP per deal or whatever. And you could have other types of things where you're just actually offering an additional reward totally separate as a way to trial some of these, where it becomes economic interest in other ways. And so I wonder how you get to being able to have flexibility right there when we're just doing it by chopping up block reward, which has been, I think, the only thing really tested. And it is this zero-sum game. And it is a zero-sum game that affects the predictability of business operations directly, where you're like, great, like we're going to do it by giving this multiplier. And that means the people who already have their business are like, oh, but that's going to decrease my multiplier. You end up with this very competitive thing. And so if you want to have that flexibility, you probably want to decouple those. You want to do something like, we're going to take a 10% tax on the block reward or something like that into a pool. And then we'll use that pool to run these sorts of experiments. But what we're going to promise is we're not going to run these experiments to directly affect your business. We're going to do one change of somehow figuring out how we move an experimentation pool. And now we have a pool that can be used for running experiments and figuring out how we do things more slowly to achieve predictability. So I think there's something around that decoupling that gives you the space to have experiments that by having them directly in this structure, we haven't made yet.
As a bit of an aside, because I have to run for another talk, one of the things that I think you did a really good job of is highlighting the complexity of these kinds of design spaces. This is not just about the Filecoin Plus program. It is not just about protocol specifications. It's not just about going through the FIPS process to make reform efforts. It's also about asserting values for the Filecoin network. It's also about quantification models for all of those things. It is an incredibly difficult design problem that has a lot of intersecting components that all sit at the heart of the Filecoin protocol and the Filecoin mission. This is why people care about this, and it is why, in my personal opinion, really iterating upon this subsidy model has been difficult, and we have not made much progress. And my question is, to everyone, I suppose, though I have to leave, so sorry, is what is the actual, like before we begin to pull out these component spaces and figure out what is worth pursuing and designing for, like what is the actual structure needed in order to have these conversations consistently? Because speaking from experience, this is a really hard thing to build and maintain. And I think it's something that we're used to designing things that are much more like point A to point B. That doesn't mean that they lack complexities, but it means that the complexities involved in something like this is much more different than the kinds of projects that a lot of folks are really used to working on with much greater efficiency. I don't know if, Galen, you have thoughts about this, having worked on this for a long time, but I'm not kidding. I really have to go. So
I know. Thank you.
let me
Enjoy
know
your next talk.
What you think?
So I think that one of the things you build up is a thing that Will and Molly are also touching on, which is this idea of like we are using this block reward, and like QAP feeds into block reward, and like we are using this like block reward as like this one incentive, like that is the carrot, right? And there is a complicated calculation that people use to like get it, and I feel that we become kind of stymied in this way where people are building their business based on what they think Filecoin is, or what they think the block reward ROI calculation is going to be, what they think they have like signed up for. And we're like, oh, well, we can't change this system because that would change the block reward, and like people are going to be antagonists to that. But like fundamentally, the block multiplier, like the block reward calculation changes over time anyway. Like we've crossed baseline, and there were all these people saying that like when we cross baseline, the network's gonna stutter, and we're all gonna like leave, and we're all gonna flip the network and go the other way, and that didn't happen, right? And so it's like we consistently will hear from people in the community very strong vocal opinions about something. You can't make this change, my business won't survive. And yet, we sometimes do make these changes, and they sometimes adjust to survive. An example of this is when we launched, you disagree? Have you looked at our graphs? Yeah, I'm not saying that everyone is thriving, but if you looked at Spark retrieval, in the past like 3 months, Spark retrieval has significantly increased in adoption, in people working with that team to like make changes to it, to add comments to what works and what doesn't, and to increase their reporting to Spark. Part of that is because we increased in the Phil Plus program using that as a retrieval standard. And people are like, that will never work, we can't do it. And yet when we did, they said, fine, we will adapt to do so. Like, no, do I think that we can make whole scale like changes and say everyone will like definitely get on board? No. Like we have to do these things in like a measured way. But I think that we consistently find ourselves not making change because we can't appease everyone, and then people still are failing and leaving the network anyway. Yeah.
I do want to know that a lot of it's also just like lack of trust and poor communication. So in a lot of the incentives conversation I've been a part of, it kind of feels like one side thinks the other side is stupid or treats the other side as if they're stupid, and then the other side acts as if they're being attacked, and you get nowhere. So like, that's something that needs to stop. But I don't know how to fix that.
Yeah. Molly?
Yeah, I keep stacking up my comments. Maybe to Will's point first, you were like, hey, have we done other experimentations on how to reward valuable data onboarding? And there's been a lot of experimentation. There was Slingshot, which was an experiment on rewarding open source data sets, rewarding data preparers, rewarding the data sets themselves. There's a open grants program right now with a set of Phil bounties specifically for onboarding ramps that are onboarding with on-chain deal payments, which has I think the first round is a pot of 75K Phil in rewards to be allocated across those onboarders, proportional to the amount of data they onboard and their published deal prices. So it's trying to incentivize, and these are all things that are happening fully outside of the block reward, which means that there are parties in the ecosystem that are stepping up and ponying up their own cash to try and run these their own Phil, to try and run these experiments, to try and support the ecosystem in getting to try out these other mechanisms of evaluating and rewarding useful data onboarding, because really the thrust for the whole network is trying to reach towards the product market fit of like, it's a sustainable system. It offers storage services that are useful and paid for by a scaling ecosystem of adopters, and that we are able to onboard those users, prove out our value add, build the tooling that's needed to make sure that we offer a good UX service, and then scale that to internet scale adoption. And so like, I definitely see that being varied. I think there is the idea of creating some sort of a testing space that is segmented from baseline block rewards, whether that's specifically taking what's above the baseline and turning that into some sort of pool that can then be allocated to experiments. You could also treat it as a DAO voting. This is something Jennifer and I were just talking about, of like, whoa, okay, you have this pool of block rewards that at least right now is not expected to be deployed, which is like what's above the baseline and what is therefore not getting minted. What if you instead put that in some sort of a DAO that allows funding specific programs or specific experiments that can be governed by the storage provider community or the client community or Filecoin community in general, based on various different like DAO membership criteria. And so we could create some sort of like scheme that allowed us to experiment with these things before identifying, yes, we want to like bring that into the block reward. The downside is you're not going to get to see all of the incentive implications if it's not embedded into that. So it's not a full sustainable trial. You'll be able to see some set of things, but you won't be able to see, hey, people have now stopped sealing committed capacity sectors and they're going to do this other thing instead based on the ratio of block rewards or something like that. Because until you actually embed it into the full block reward mechanism, which makes experimentation really difficult.
Mm-hmm. I don't know how we're doing on time.
I think we have like 10.
Okay, cool.
very sorry. I have another talk, so like I missed your whole talk.
It's all right. It's
like,
recorded, apparently.
I just have like a couple thoughts I want to share. Like maybe not like super actionable. So like I beg for patience and everything. But I was here when like Will and Marta started like to talk, right? Like I have a couple comments over there. So I don't think it's a secret that people that know. I don't think the existing Filecoin Plus program is effective for a while, right? Like people have heard that, and I want to like, why is that? I just feel like everyone have different opinions on what Filecoin Plus is supposed to be doing. I have heard many perspectives just in the past 10 minutes. Some people think it's like, incentive for like storage providers to offer like cheaper storage and getting demand, or like to the end users, it's like, okay, cheap storage incentivized by Filecoin network for public good data or whatever. I also heard people think, okay, it's actually incentive for people who are building toolings that are making onboarding data into this decentralized network like easier. It's all different purpose, like targeting different audience, bring different benefits to different like audience. However, where is the money going to? Who is getting the block rewards? It's the storage providers, right? They are getting the block rewards. However, we're hoping that they will be using those money to feed back to the other audience that we are trying to get benefit from the network. Again, tooling builders, on-ramp builders, all those folks. I do believe there are storage providers already to do that, like sharing the revenue and all those, but it's not all the storage providers, right? There will be storage providers, it's like, hey, I'm just like joining Filecoin, providing storage and treating this as a mining protocol. Like, and I think it's fair, it's still valuable to the network, it's because they're contributing to the network consensus, right? I think it's useful, again, as long as, yeah. Yes. Is the data itself, but as long as you're providing some service to the network, I think it's useful. Like, so it's okay for them to not do the revenue, like sharing and things like that. The problem is, like Marta was saying, but most of the storage provider join Filecoin at least to build a business to have some profit. When there's one way that's known and proved to be the easiest way to maximize the profit, which is getting data cap and getting those data on Filecoin right now. Yet, this incentive for them to think out of the box and allocate more resources, like to build more useful things, and which is also killing kind of the dynamic storage market that we are hoping to see on the Filecoin network. Because there's one way that service providers, they just know I can make money from that. And I feel like a lot of the new services and the offering that we wanted to be implementing for Filecoin, the existing Filecoin Plus mechanism is actually a road bump on that. It like slow us to evolve the different features, because again, like you said, storage providers are used to certain things. They are more adaptive to keep doing what they already know. They are already studied, instead of like spending more resources to invest in exploring other features on the network.
Can I have one very brief comment here? So I think, I don't know how often it happens in the world, but UK government has this thing that says that if you have certain amount of patents filings, every year you get a tax reduction, a quite significant one. So basically they say like, if you're an innovative company, we will give you money for being an innovative company. It can pay basically for 2 or 3 full-time employees. It's quite significant. It does feel to me sometimes like when we talk about Phil Plus, everybody's like, well, I am doing something around tech, so why UK government wouldn't give me the money as well? Well, because you're not creating or inventing things, right? Phil Plus is about very specific incentivization of certain behavior. If you don't behave that way, that's okay. I know that the model or the economics is quite broken in the way that it is hard to be a storage provider without the data cap part of it. But I think that's a different problem to fixing Phil Plus. It's a problem of fixing how storage providers exist without Phil Plus, if it makes sense.
I mean, it's also a reflection that we're over 10%. Like right now, we have a lot of capacity compared to the deals. And so one way to look at this is the incentive working as designed, that the network does not need more capacity right now. And so the network is not incentivizing more people providing storage without Fill Plus. That's not something that the network wants to pay for. If you have clients and are doing it externally, you can build a business where you get that external client money to pay and offset the cost of doing that. But the network is saying what it needs in equalizing that ratio of 90 to 10% is more paid deals right now.
Riva.
Yes. So I don't agree with a lot of the stuff said here, but we'll take this to the bar. Let me give you a possible solution to this. So do I understand correctly that your problem is basically you're not able to run experiments, right? Without a lot of pushback and and leaving people in the dust and so on
I
and so
don't
forth.
currently know a way to run on-chain subsidy experiments.
Right. So Philos, almost every week, resets a new network. And the beauty about bytes is they're bytes. And the beauty of snarks that once you verify it, it's always verified. So effectively what you can do is you can do incentivized testnets, which are side chains. So you allow any kind of POREP that is validated on the main chain to be used on the new chain as well, except on the new chain you have to use collateral and Fill Plus or whatever it is from a different pool. And what you basically do with this is that the operator who already runs a mainnet node, their storage is already paid by the mainnet, their POREP is paid by the mainnet. The only thing they're doubling is the window posts and the collateral and the onboarding messages for snaps and stuff like that. And effectively what you do at this point is you can say, hey, we're incentivizing people to join this network, and we have this pool of money as a reward, but we only will disperse it if the network reaches an outcome that we like. You may reveal the outcome, you may not even reveal the outcome because it's a group exercise, right? And if this testnet burns to the ground in the next 2 weeks, you're like, fine, let's do the next one. And moreover, you can experiment with deals that are minimum 5 weeks and maximum 10 weeks or whatever you want. So if your question is how do I run a succession of these experiments, just run experiments.
Yes, I think one of the questions is will people? Fill Plus is not just what are the on-chain rules and what is the outcome. It's how do people, pragmatic, rational actors, how do they change their behavior in min-max in order to utilize it? And so I think one of the questions is that actual human interaction available in doing a testnet side chain versus just taking it as a snapshot? So what I'm wondering is if we do something like that, if we run a side chain, and let's use the example of deal pricing, and we're like, okay, we're going to do a sidechain pool on incentivizing and creating an on-chain subsidy for on-chain deal pricing. And those need to be stood up and exist for X amount of time. If we publish that, people would need to actually record a deal price on-chain on mainnet as well? No.
No, because the testnet is an actual network.
Okay.
It continues to exist. The only thing that is different is that it takes the POREPs from an existing chain so that the main two cost drivers for an SP, which is to do SDR and the initial proof, and to spin the drives to answer challenges, are already covered by the other network. But this side chain, aside from taking in pre-proven capacity effectively, everything else is separate. So you give it a separate budget, you give it a separate set of rules, separate so on and so forth. And then at the end of the exercise, you as a runner decide how much these funny tokens, the testnet tokens, are actually worth, and you disperse them based on this on-chain record. And the chain is as secure as the hardware that got doubled from the mainnet. So it is actual hardware and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
My question would be, like what Galen was saying was like, let's compare that idea. And I like the brainstorming mode we're in. So that idea of like, we create a side chain, now you have additional overhead as a storage trader, you have to decide whether or not to participate in that other chain or do any activity
Minimal
on it.
overhead.
Sorry?
The additional overhead is minimal.
Minimal
Run one more
overhead.
node, that's it.
Yeah, but you're gonna have to publish stuff to both chains. I mean, it's not that much, but it, especially if you're doing deal collateral and you're reasoning about it, we've had a lot of experience working with large scale groups of storage providers. It's a communication complexity challenge, but let's say we could do that model, or we could do the model of, at some period of time, we're like, great, we're gonna run a synthetic challenge just on mainnet of doing that, and you'll have then a scaling reward pool similar to Space Race, where you just reward based on all that activity happening on mainnet, and you decide how to scale that reward pool, looking back at how people actually behaved in practice on mainnet, which might have, take deal pricing, for example. As a client, I might pay a deal that's happening on mainnet and a deal that's happening on a temporary experimental sidenet have different longevities, have different long-term, right now they're all pay up front, right? So you'd be paying for a 5-year deal in one place, and you'd be paying for a however long this test is gonna run deal in the other place. And so that would probably all lead to kind of synthetic deal payments by storage providers in the testnet. Whereas on mainnet, maybe at least some subset of that is like real on-chain client smart contracts that are, interacting and using FVM or something like that. So is it equivalent, or is there something to run, or not equivalent, but like, could we do what you're suggesting, but just in snapshots of mainnet over a period of time and then rewarding real mainnet behavior? Or is there something related to like, it costs too much gas or something that wouldn't be achieved?
You could do that, but the larger point is that whenever you commit data, you commit it on the mainnet. It's just that whatever ends up in mainnet is also, you can even subsidize it, copy it into the sidechain. So when a client is working with a test SP, while they're doing stuff on the sidechain, they're also committing to the main chain. So the data is not like, the data doesn't live in two places. Right, but also the collateral today doesn't really play a role. Like we wish it would, but it is a rounding error. That's why we see the terminations and so on and so forth, right? So the risk is not that large. Anyway, that's just a space to explore, because we seem to be drifting into how do we make this on mainnet, because even if you figured out a way to do everything on mainnet with retroactive rewards and so on and so forth, you still have the problem that anything is minimum 6 months. If you want to do any kind of duration-based test, you bump into that. You have to stake like actual fuel plus actual collateral on the mainnet and so on and so forth. If you do this on a sidechain, you literally can have different durations for all of this.
Okay, awesome. This was a fantastic, we actually started generating some ideas. This is what I wanted. I wanted this to be more hacky and conversant. I think we can all agree that many of us disagree about all different aspects of this. We also agree that if the block reward remains kind of the only pot, then we remain constrained. We remain limited. If we are just saying, what is this one block reward that we're going to look to, the system remains constrained in what we can incentivize. And I think that we can agree that we need more room for experimentation, protocol experimentation and on-chain experimentation. And I think one of the things that sort of Caitlin brought up is we need containers and rules for this engagement. How do we start to run these tests in a way, and like how do we even have the conversation of what the experiment should be and what we want to incentivize? And some of the things that came up are around testnets or other tokens or bounties, but what is kind of the evolution of a system that allows us to have more room for rapid experimentation with all these divisive stakeholders? So thanks everybody. Thanks for your time. Enjoy the rest of your Dev Summit.